One of the most influential elements of modern popular culture is the rise of large film franchises consisting of multiple movies with a shared storyline. Franchises such as Marvel Comics' cinematic universe and the reboot of Star Wars films for the modern era are prominent examples of this rise. Both of these series consist of large-scale blockbusters where some films focus on major plot points, while others involve smaller side stories, but all of them contribute to a single overall shared universe in which each story resides. While these examples are two of the more prominent ones, many film companies have attempted to accomplish this same feat to varying degrees of success. From DC Comics' movie franchise that has been met with mixed reviews to Universal Studios' almost universally disliked Dark Universe, there have been many attempts to capture the adoration from fans and the lucrative nature found in the best of these franchises. For the baby boomer generation, this phenomenon can be more easily understood by relating to the film serials that became popular in the first half of the 20th century, as well as the earliest examples of similar large-scale series of movies. Furthermore, analyzing this particular form of popular culture through various perspectives can create a deeper understanding of it in general. While film serials include some of the earliest forms of filmmaking in the silent era, their popularity continued to grow into the 1950s, and their influence can be seen even beyond that, meaning many older baby boomers are likely to be familiar with them. There are many practices unique to film serials that have a striking resemblance to modern practices used in the large film franchises today. A major example is that film serials consisted of multiple parts of a single storyline that were released at regular intervals. This practice is reminiscent of how modern movie franchises handle their release schedule. For example, Marvel movies are often spaced out by a few months and announced long before their release date, so the audience always knows roughly when to expect the next installment of the story. Similarly, the new Star Wars movies have a fairly steady release schedule since they started in 2015, with a main installment being released at the end of the year, followed the next year by a smaller story, then another main installment following that. This periodic aspect of modern movie franchises serves the same purpose as it did for the film serials of years ago. From a functionalist perspective, it creates something for audience to look forward to and expect regularly, thus forming a sort of cultural ritual and strengthening social solidarity. From a critical perspective, the frequency and large number of new installments creates a steady income of millions of dollars per movie for the studios in charge, giving them incentive to create more movies at regular intervals to maximize profit. This is especially notable as the two aforementioned examples are owned by the same company, Disney. This regularity ties in with another similarity between the two forms of popular culture, the fact that each installment of both prioritizes getting the viewer to return to see the next part. This was done in the serials primarily by cliffhanger endings. Nearly every part of a serial ended with a scene that left the viewer desperately wanting the next part to see what happens next. This is a practice frequently employed by modern film series. Notable examples include Star Wars Episode 7, ending with the dramatic reveal of a dearly beloved character, Luke Skywalker, and DC Comics' Batman vs. Superman, ending with a short scene that teased the revival of Superman. Marvel movies are also notorious for this, as the after-credits scene has become a staple of their films. This aspect has essentially the same purpose as the previous point on periodic presentations of both mediums, but the critical perspective is even easier to understand here. Put simply, a bigger audience means a bigger profit, so ensuring the audience will come back to see the sequel also ensures that money will be made. By the end of the 1950s, the classic film serial format was nearly wiped out, but in its place came the rise of early examples of large movie franchises in the 1960s and 1970s. These new franchises, however, borrowed from serials in many ways. The most obvious example is how these serials influenced the Star Wars movies, from their episodic nature to even the scrolling text that opens them. These shared similarities can also be seen in the modern examples of movie franchises. For example, all three mediums of pop culture often involved some kind of likable action hero that would always defeat the villains in the end. These characters include Commando Cody and Flash Gordon of the serials, Luke Skywalker and James Bond of the early franchises, and of course the superhero straight from the comic book seen in many modern franchises. This idea of a righteous central character who fights evil and acts heroic is an example of a shared image or symbol that is emphasized as a major aspect of popular culture in the functionalist perspective. Audiences can look up to these heroes and find solidarity in the fact that these characters are widely liked and, in more extreme cases, even idolized. Another example of a shared convention of all three mediums is the emphasis on special effects and spectacle. While primitive compared to the capabilities of modern technology, the spectacle seen in the serials was an important part of captivating audiences. The transformation of the main character into the titular Captain Marvel with a puff of smoke and a flash of light was a spectacular visual in the Adventures of Captain Marvel, as was the visual of Commando Cody taking flight with his jetpack in one of his many serials. The James Bond films are known for their use of stunts to produce a similar effect, and the early Star Wars films include a multitude of visually interesting effects, from lasers to exploding planets. Examples of special effects such as these in modern films of this nature are plentiful due to the capabilities of computer graphics, making large-scale visuals like battles that destroy New York City as seen in The Avengers quite possible to accomplish on screen. The importance of visual effects in these films comes from how spectacle is a key feature of popular culture, as Danesi discusses in his writing on the subject. This spectacle can also be seen from the critical's perspective as just a way to bring in larger audiences that are impressed by such effects and can therefore excuse any weaker elements of a film. The Transformers franchise, for example, has been accused of producing movies with minimal plot but lots of visual effects in order to get large profits without much effort. While the comparisons to early film franchises are important for the generation that grew up with them to better understand modern film franchises, there are important distinctions that make these modern films unique. One of the most important of these distinctions is the emphasis on creating a universe in modern franchises. Serials and early film franchises focus on stories told in parts that come together to form one large plotline. In contrast, modern film franchises focus on creating a universe in which many different stories and plotlines take place. Marvel movies are a good example. The 2008 film Iron Man has no plotline in common with the 2011 film Captain America, yet the two titular characters both appear in films such as The Avengers, and the plots of the former two movies are important to the latter. In this way, Marvel has created a fictional world where many stories, 20 released with 3 more already announced, overlap but still can be independent of each other. This is done similarly in Star Wars franchise, in how the newer main films consist of sequels to the plotline of the first movies, while other films consist of small, self-contained stories that don't necessarily affect the overall plotline. This is an important way in which the modern movies set themselves apart from their predecessors because it allows them to do things on a much larger scale and tell smaller stories that expand on the overall story, without necessarily contributing large elements to it. It allows for the created world to become more interesting and expansive, as they aren't limited to a single storyline to follow. While again it is easy to be critical of this and say it is merely to make more movies and sell more tickets, it is important to recognize the impact these franchises have on fans that often get together in hundreds to celebrate and appreciate them, which is a perfect example of Durkheim's idea of collective effervescence. Due to the widespread popularity that some of these franchises have, audiences as well as the people that create them are diverse groups, and therefore perspectives of many groups are reflected. This leads to examples of appropriation of cultures as discussed by Rubin and Melnick in Immigration in American Popular Culture. While this phenomenon happens frequently and often small ways, the most obvious example is the film Black Panther, an installment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Director Ryan Coogler appropriated a variety of traditional African cultures in order to create a setting and story that reflects the struggles of African Americans in the modern United States. Coogler was able to create a film that was personal to his own experiences while using different cultures to show it, which is a clear example of Rubin and Melnick's idea of a masquerade. Rather than completely using African culture as a mask, it is instead used to reflect issues of another and acts as empowering to both. In conclusion, modern movie franchises are able to attract large amounts of fans and remain extremely lucrative largely through the conventions they share with film serials and film franchises from the 1950s to the 1970s. These conventions allow for audience members to experience social solidarity with one another because of how they create common meanings and symbols as well as social rituals. From a critical perspective, however, these franchises are designed in such a way that allows them to gain as much profit as possible in how frequently they're produced and how they can retain the audience that's willing to pay for the price of admission. Members of the baby boomer generation can more easily understand this cultural phenomenon because of the similar structure and conventions seen in the films they experienced as they were growing up. They must also, however, consider the different scope of modern films and how they aim to create something larger than their predecessors.